The acquisition and acceptance of California due to its quick settlement by the 49ers during the gold rush accomplished the long-held informal goal of manifest destiny. America finally stretched from sea to shining sea. The lack of a frontier, however, posed a significant problem. As historian Frederick Jackson Turner wrote in his seminal work, The Significance of the Frontier in American History, nearly every single major event in American history up until this point was done because of or in order to accomplish expansion into the frontier. Accomplishing manifest destiny meant that America now faced the conundrum of what it meant to be an American without a frontier. Later presidents would go on and identify new frontiers, with Teddy Roosevelt looking beyond the shores of America for new lands to conquer, setting off America's imperial age. Herbert Hoover would look at the concept of a frontier in an abstract fashion, proclaiming that new discoveries in science and their flow of new inventions will continue to create 1,000 new frontiers for those who would still adventure. While John F. Kennedy would proclaim that we stand today on the edge of a new frontier while announcing the beginning of the space race. Clearly, the notion of a frontier is central to American identity. Fortunately for individuals living in the later portion of the 19th century, there still remained one frontier within America's literal borders. Having gold rushed their way to the coast, the nation now turned its attention to settling the untamed Great Plains, an inhospitable area known as America's desert. Little did they know at the time that their efforts in this area would later shift the agricultural center of the nation, nor that it would result in a second genocide of the indigenous peoples that stubbornly called the land theirs. You're listening to A Push Through History, a resource designed to help students completing the course of AP US History. This episode covers the first subject of Period 6, 1865 to 1898, Taming the West. Coming off of the Civil War, the Congressional Radical Republicans wanted to reconstruct the entire nation, not just the occupied South. In their minds, it was essential that America be put back together in a manner that would prevent it from ever breaking again. But putting Humpty Dumpty back together was just one piece of the puzzle. They also had to determine why he fell in the first place. Beyond slavery, the Republican leaders of Congress believed that the haphazard nature of the West's land rush, as well as Andrew Jackson's elimination of the National Bank, played a role in the disintegration of the Union. They began the settlement of the Great Plains with the advent of Abraham Lincoln's Homestead Act, which virtually gave away 160 acres to any American that was willing to live on the land while improving it during the first 5 years. The move attracted a number of Americans, including exodusters, a group of African Americans who had come to the realization that the Jim Crow South didn't desire to have freedmen such as them living amongst them as equals. Economically, the architects of the post-Civil War rebranding of America came to believe that trade was the key to keeping the nation together, particularly access to the far-flung Asian market. William Seward, the architect of the policy, served as Secretary of State under Lincoln and Andrew Johnson. In his estimation, Asia would become the chief theater of world events, and that commerce there was the key to America's future prosperity. As part of the plan, the United States purchased Alaska from Russia, considered invading Canada, and began to bully territories such as Hawaii into joining our cause, or at least to provide enough territory to establish a military refueling site. Exhausted militarily from the Civil War, the United States ultimately decided to forego foreign conquest, instead finding a way to get to the Asian market through the land that they already possessed. Although California was now a state, their infrastructure had yet to be built up, meaning that a lot of the industrialized goods that would traverse the Pacific Ocean came from the industrialized Northeast, in cities like New York. For such a feat, they needed the Trans-Pacific Railroad. Illinois Senator Stephen Douglas was influential in getting the railroad routed through Chicago, ensuring that it would become a world-class city, despite the fact that at this particular moment in history it was just another Midwest slaughterhouse city. The South had hoped to route the railroad through their territories, even going so far as to initiate the Gadsden Purchase, which saw the U.S. acquire the lower portion of Arizona from Mexico in order to establish a viable route. But politics eventually ran their course, creating yet another Northern victory in the post-Civil War era. The railroad had won the transportation wars, proving better than canals and highways as they were impervious to weather events, ran in the dark, and required little rest for its conductors. Although they could have nationalized the industry, the government decided to turn to private investors, creating the types of winners which would result in the rise of the captains of industry, men such as Andrew Carnegie and John Rockefeller, who would come to dominate the American landscape in the coming decades. These men received help in the form of government loans, subsidies, and large grants of public land. Meanwhile, the government shielded industries vital to its future by establishing protective tariffs, particularly for the steel industry, which had risen to prominence after the Bessemer process in England had perfected it. Such tariffs also served to reduce the Civil War debt that had been accumulated. Without nationwide income taxes, tariff revenue served to erase the debt by 1880, generating a huge budget surplus, which in turn could be flipped to provide further economic stimulus for the railroad industry. Boomtowns popped up across the interior of the country, but these and Lincoln's Homestead Act weren't enough to populate the interior of the nation. Lincoln's land grants were appropriate for a major farm in the east. In the Great Plains, however, 160 acres weren't enough to create a comfortable living, with estimates at the time figuring that in order to make ends meet, a grain farmer would need at least 300 acres of crops. Worse, the environment was inhospitable, requiring massive amounts of difficult work to establish oneself. For instance, would-be farmers needed to remove a thick layer of sod before they were able to plant anything. The substance was so thick that a large number of settlers lived in soddies, houses which used the discarded grass segment as their roof. Pseudoscience was also used to cajole early Americans to brave the Great Desert, with it being proclaimed that rain follows the plow. And one Harvard professor promoted the idea that the steel railroad tracks would attract moisture to the area. In addition to the 6,000 exodusters, 105,000 men and women came from far-flung Scandinavia, setting off a new wave of immigration which resulted temporarily in Norwegian becoming the main language spoken in parts of Minnesota and the Dakotas. Despite their tenacity, particularly that of the single women, who would go on to own between 15 to 20% of all land claims in North Dakota, the environment oftentimes proved to be too much. Clouds of grasshoppers would devour entire fields of healthy crops, while prairie fires, hailstorms, and tornadoes proved to be lethal dangers that Americans weren't accustomed to. It was only after experience on the plains that the word blizzard was added to the English language in the 1870s. One Nebraska farmer described his chosen homeland by stating that the Great Plains had a wind hot as an oven's fury, It was a land that raged like a pestilence, leaving farmers helpless with no weapon against this terrible and inscrutable wrath of nature. A large number of these environmental problems were self-inflicted, however, as the destruction of local biodiversity opened up pathways for exotic destructive pests and weeds. Hindsight is 20/20, but one historian proclaimed that it was the largest, longest-run agricultural and environmental miscalculation in American history. To encourage more individuals to take on this task, the nation began to promote railroad tourism. As part of the effort, the Northern Pacific Railroad lobbied Congress for the creation of Yellowstone National Park, a one-of-a-kind destination designed to draw individuals out to the west. While the creation of the park was an important step towards developing a nationwide ethic of respect for land and wildlife, the U.S. soldiers that ran the park mostly spent their time hunting indigenous Americans who continued to hunt within the reserve. Rather than farming, the Great Plains began to be used for cattle ranching. Absent private land holders, cowboys would perform a long drive, guiding their herds across hundreds and in some instances thousands of miles to market. The culture and tools that were used, including branding, chaps, and spurs, had all been developed for the Southwest by Mexican ranchers. Even the famed Longhorns descended from Spanish stock, but the people of Texas quickly made it all their own. By the end of the Civil War, an estimated 5 million cattle roamed the Texas ranges. Historian Alan Brinkley writes that a long drive was a spectacular sight, and not surprisingly, it became the most romanticized and mythologized aspect of life in the West. It began with the spring or calf roundup. The cattlemen rounded up stocks from the open range, herds containing the stock of many different owners, with only their brands to distinguish them from one another. The combined herds, usually numbering from 2,000 to 5,000 head, moved out. Cowboys representing each of the major ranchers accompanied them. Most of the cowboys in the early years were veterans of the Confederate Army. The next largest group consisted of African Americans, more than 500,000 of them. Western romance novels and traveling sideshows such as Buffalo Bill's Wild West show helped to popularize and romanticize the life of a cowboy, further encouraging more settlers to take up the difficult life of an early settler on the Great Plains. Mark Twain wrote a number of stories and poems that helped to draw up interest in frontier life, including Huck Finn, which served as a vehicle of escape from the ever-encroaching civilization. Despite the propaganda, both cattle ranchers and farmers ran the very real risk of running afoul of the natives that still laid claim to the interior of the nation. Indian attacks were initially sporadic, mostly because of the natives' desire to culturally prove their leadership abilities by engaging in battle. But after gold was discovered in Nevada, the Rockies, and the Black Hills of South Dakota, settlers came in massive numbers that were impossible to ignore. Despite the fact that the 19th century was dawning, these natives had managed to maintain a semblance of their old life, one that revolved around the transient buffalo. While Americans believed that they were bringing order to a virgin land, they weren't settling an empty West. Rather, they were unsettling it by taking it from native people who already lived there. Buffalo hides became fashionable along the East Coast at this point, and along with the profits of selling off the majestic beast's meat to railroad companies, became the favorite target of cash-seeking hunters. Ignoring the natives' take-only-what-you-need approach, settlers quickly reduced the number of buffalo on the Great Plains to an unsustainable level, causing them to go virtually extinct by 1883. The hunters went where the herds roamed, causing conflict with the indigenous people of the plains who followed in their wake. As the Indians struggled with the growing threats to their way of life, war parties would attack isolated wagon trains, stagecoaches, and far-flung ranches. At this point, the U.S. Army became involved in hunting down natives which were deemed dangerous. Among the Army divisions were 4 groups of all African American regiments made up of Civil War veterans. These soldiers earned the reputation of being particularly strong and fierce warriors. That, as well as the fact that the natives believed that their hair felt like the hide of their sacred animal, were deemed buffalo soldiers. Across the Great Plains, boomtowns came and went with mining discoveries. Silver in Nevada resulted in the creation of Virginia City, which boasted its own Shakespearean theater, a stock exchange, and 100 saloons. But it was only temporary. With men outnumbering women 2 to 1, prostitution began to flourish, giving the town an unseemly reputation. 21 years after its creation, this minor metropolis became a ghost town, leaving behind a ravaged landscape with mountains of debris, poisoned water sources, and surrounding land stripped of timber. As the Congress passed the General Mining Act, individual panhandlers were replaced with megacorporations that began to permanently alter the landscape. It also began the formal removal of Native Americans to a system of reservations. Designated as a concentration policy, the federal government's involvement was initially viewed as a welcome change from the individual private treaties that were continually being forced upon them by encroaching settlers. In 1851, each tribe was assigned its own defined reservation confirmed by a treaty chief. Brinkley writes that the new arrangement had many benefits for whites and few for the Indians. It divided the tribes from one another and made them easier to control. It allowed the government to force tribes into scattered locations and to take over the most desirable lands for white settlement. Wanting to further encroach upon native land, the policy was reimagined in 1867 to create 2 large reservations in Oklahoma and the Dakotas for all native tribes of the plains. The Indian Wars were a result of the change that had been forced upon the region. White settlers and natives both came to the conclusion that neither could coexist peacefully, and killings increased throughout the time period. Chief Red Cloud took up arms in Montana, burning 2 forts that had been designed to protect the construction of a major highway to California. Despite being warned of their prowess in battle, General Custer led his 7th Cavalry, which consisted of a mere 210 soldiers, against a native force that may have exceeded 2,500 warriors. The slaughter proved to be the U.S. Army's worst loss of life on the plains. The success encouraged Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull to join his campaign, but despite the setback of Little Bighorn, the advancement of the U.S. Army proved to be unstoppable. After the 2 brave warriors were returned to their reservation, they were executed by their own people in retaliation for the men risking a war which could have exterminated the entire tribe. Chief Joseph and the Nez Perce ran 1,321 miles across 75 days in fear of military retaliation for the accidental killing of 4 white settlers. And the Sioux Ghost Dance movement was disbanded shortly after establishing itself as a uniting force for natives on the plains. Dancers for the Sioux believed that they had seen a vision of the coming Messiah who would lead the whites away from the plains. The prophecy turned out to be false, however, merely leading the adherents of the Ghost Dance movement to the massacre at Wounded Knee. Even when natives went along with American policy, they seemed to suffer. Chief Black Kettle brought his tribe's men, women, and children to a peace meeting with an American Army chief, only to discover that the Army had brought along drunken, unemployed miners to the meeting. The resulting Sand Creek massacre saw 133 killed, 105 of whom were women and children. There were voices against the suffering that was inflicted. Captain Silas Soule refused to give the order to fire, stating that it was hard to see little children on their knees having their brains beat out by men professing to be civilized. Another officer, on the other hand, happily revealed to friends that, "I killed all I could. I think and earnestly believe the Indian to be an obstacle to civilization and should be exterminated." In this way, Indians were removed from the Great Plains, in the same way that farmers cleared sod and railroaders laid down steel tracks. Any obstacle to settling the frontier was eliminated. Worried for the soul of the nation, Episcopalian Bishop Henry Whipple wrote to President Buchanan warning that a nation which sows robbery will reap a harvest of blood. But the promise of riches muted the nation's conscience. The last holdouts on the plain were the Apache, beneath the leadership of Geronimo. Although he had originally accepted reservation life, he eventually found it lacking, proclaiming that it had nothing but cactus, rattlesnakes, heat, rock, and insects. Many of our people died of starvation. He, too, however, was eventually forced to surrender against the might of the U.S. Army. The Indian Wars helped to establish life on the reservation, which was safer from marauding bands of settlers who proved willing to serve as the judge, jury, and executioners of the Wild West. But just because they were contained didn't mean that America was done with them. Pointing to multiple failed military campaigns, growing army atrocities, and egregious corruption in the government's Indian Bureau, reformers called for new policies that would destroy Native people's traditional lifestyles in order to civilize them. In other words, they began to develop policies which would kill the Indian in order to save the man. The Dawes Act of 1887 introduced sweeping legislation designed to assimilate Native Americans into mainstream culture by turning them into subsistence farmers. Believing that large reservations encouraged the natives to stubbornly cling to their former lives, they divided the land up into small homesteads for farming. Separating extended families was believed to create distance between past connections, paving the way for a new future. It wasn't just done out of the generosity of their hearts, however, as all land deemed surplus reverted back to the federal government. Considering that a second genocide had come with the Indian Wars, reducing the estimated population of natives from 800,000 to a mere 500,000, millions of acres were legally seized, resulting in many of the reservations now being unsuitable for the large numbers of natives in the present day. The policy was a disaster, with the Bureau of Indian Affairs seizing more than 15 million surplus acres, opening up Oklahoma for settlement. Between 1880 and 1930, natives lost 66% of the individually allotted lands via fraud, mismanagement, and pressure to sell to wealthy whites. One of the biggest movies of 2023, Killers of the Flower Moon, explores the effects of that on the native people who were legitimately attempting to assimilate to the demands imposed upon them. Assimilation leveled up with the introduction of Indian boarding schools, which, as an official policy, was launched in 1879 with the establishment of the Carlisle Indian Industrial School of Pennsylvania beneath the leadership of Captain Richard Henry Pratt. The school's goal was nothing short of erasing indigenous identities. At schools like Carlisle, children were forbidden to speak their native languages, practice their traditions, or wear the clothing of their tribes. Their hair was often cut short, something that many native cultures considered taboo. Additionally, they were given English names and forced to adopt Christianity. In exchange for the theft of their identity, they were trained on basic academics and given a healthy dose of manual labor designed to prepare boys for blue-collar jobs and girls for a life of domestic servitude. Beyond the erasing of their culture, the physical and emotional toll on these children was immense, as they were regularly forced to abandon their families. Reports from the time and survivor testimonies in later years reveal widespread neglect, malnutrition, and abuse. Diseases like tuberculosis ran rampant due to overcrowded and unsanitary living conditions. At Carlisle alone, 200 of its students are buried in its cemetery, as they had proven to be unable to cope with the rigor of their school. As the dust settles on the Great Plains, we're left with a complex and often conflicting legacy of the Gilded Age's expansion into America's last frontier. It is a story of ambition and struggle, progress and destruction, resilience and loss. The Indian Wars left scars on the land and its people, scars that remain visible today. The Dawes Act and its attempt to assimilate Native Americans by dividing communal lands into individual plots fractured tribal nations and undermined their sovereignty. When that proved to not be enough, Indian boarding schools sought to erase indigenous cultures entirely. Initially designed to draw people into the Great Plains, the Homestead Act was later amended, doubling the amount of land and further encouraging more planting of trees in order to create windbreaks on the plain. Combined with the invention of barbed wire, which allowed cattle to be fenced in over huge, massive plots of land, and windmills that began to suck water out of the aquifers beneath the plains, gradually saw the last frontier disappear. This era also saw the rise of an iconic American image, the cowboy. The cattle drives and the creation of the cattle kingdom turned the open range into a vital economic engine, one that the nation was eager to exploit. It allowed this untamed frontier to capture the imagination of a nation eager to redefine itself. Soon, cowboy culture, with its mythology of independence and grit, became the defining symbol of what it meant to be an American. But with the closing of the frontier in 1890, America faced an existential question. What comes next? Since its founding, the frontier had been crucial to shaping American democracy and character. Without it, where would that pioneering spirit go? We'll explore the answer to that question in our next episode.